18. Holly looked after the departing black coat with a twinge of disappointment. He had shown no sign, no tiny hesitation that revealed an awareness of her in any way out of the ordinary. And why should he? She asked herself. What nonsense! You don't know him, and he doesn't know you. You're just a girl who works in his shop, no more noticeable than Mr. Bath or her toe. The thought of Mrs. Bath's mysterious toe put Holly back in a good humor, and she turned to face the crowded aisles. Two gangling boys in their teens, all legs and awkwardness, were making their way through the shop. Between them, with a thin hand in each of their overgrown ones, was a frail little girl. She can't be older than 6, Holly thought, looking at her sickly face with concern. The boys had to lean forward to allow her hands to rest easily in theirs because she was so tiny, but it was obvious that they did so gladly. It was obvious that they would have stood on their heads if she had expressed any desire for them to do so. Promise me you're not too cold, Phoebe, the larger of the two boys said. I promise. I'm not too cold, said the girl softly. Mother said we should bring you back in 10 minutes, the second boy said uneasily. It's been longer than that. I don't feel tired, Georgie, really. But Mother said, Phoebe, the boy pleaded. The little girl's eyes filled with tears. Holly saw in the tired face a reflection of her own childhood self, blocked and baffled again and again by illness and by those who wanted nothing more than her happiness and comfort. She knew well the feeling of being a prisoner in loving arms. She approached the trio. The boys looked at her helplessly. She smiled at them and knelt to Phoebe's height. Isn't it lovely? She said, pointing to the snow. The little girl nodded. Look, catch one. Holly held out a snowflake. It doesn't melt. It just disappears. Poof. She dropped her voice to a whisper. It's magic. Phoebe's eyes grew larger. I never saw anything magic before. But you believed in it anyway, didn't you? The little girl nodded again. Do you want to know a secret? Another nod. The snow helps me to get better from an illness I have. It stays with me to keep me cool. Phoebe looked worried. They're always telling me that I have to keep warm. Different illnesses have different cures. You have to be warm and I have to be cold, but we can visit each other. The snow will be here for as long as I am, and if you come back to see me tomorrow, you'll see the snow then. Are you better now? Much better, almost all better. Phoebe looked up at her brothers and put her mouth to Holly's ear. The doctor told my mother that I'm not going to get better. Don't tell them, she said, glancing upward. They'll cry. Maybe you can trick the doctor, Holly said. Phoebe smiled a little. I'd like to trick him. He burnt all my dolls. He burnt them? Asked Holly, shocked. Phoebe nodded seriously. No, Phoebe, you know he had to, said the taller brother. They were contagious. He had to. Phoebe stuck out her pointed chin. He didn't have to burn them all. He didn't have to burn Tempetsy. Ah, Phoebe, any other doctor would have done it too. We can get you another doll, Phoebe, said the younger brother. There's probably a good doll right here in the shop. Holly hated to tell him that he was wrong. I'm afraid, she began apologetically, that we don't carry. She looked around the shop floor. Her satchel lay forgotten in a corner. We only carry very special dolls, she said, standing up. We don't keep them on the shelves. You'll understand when you see them. Can you just give me 5 minutes? I have to prepare it. The two boys exchanged worried glances. Our mother said to bring her home in 10 minutes, and we've been gone a good deal longer than that. Just 5 more minutes, Holly begged. Please. Well, they muttered indecisively. Yes, said Phoebe, her chin out again. Yes, if you want, Frank, I'll put on your coat while we wait. Holly was already flying to the storeroom, satchel in hand. Inside the quiet walls, she fumbled around in her bag for the porcelain that she had brought from the land of the immortals. Then, with a morsel of the clay in her hand, she closed her eyes and began to shape the soft substance with her fingers. With her eyes still tightly shut, Holly envisioned Phoebe's face, not worn and thin, but rosy and lively and stubborn. All the while her fingers stroked and smoothed, pulling a small figure from the formless stuff, giving it the vital essence that she had seen in Phoebe's eyes. Holly opened her eyes and looked down. Yes, there she was, Phoebe herself, and Phoebe as she wished to be, healthy and strong. The doll's face was round and full, but the telltale chin was the same. Her legs, poor and bony no longer, looked like limbs that could run and jump and skip and even stomp. Holly smiled. But what about clothes? A bare doll was not going to please Phoebe. Holly set the doll down and peered into her satchel. There, Lexi had packed a scarf, a rich scarf of crimson silk embroidered with blue and green leaves. Not exactly what Phoebe would wear, but better than nothing. Holly glanced about the dim room for scissors. The scarf would need to be cut. She investigated a nearby drawer. No scissors. With increasing urgency, Holly scrabbled around searching for scissors, but it was useless. Maybe she could simply fold the scarf around the doll. The doll. Holly looked down at the table and gasped with surprise. The doll was dressed in a frock of pink silk with a peacock blue sash. A cloud of dark hair floated around her face above her great brown eyes. Her cheeks were lightly tinted with pink, and her arms tapered into small, sturdy hands. The strong legs that Holly had fashioned were now clothed in white stockings and shining leather shoes, and all in all, the little figure looked as though she had just blown in from some great adventure. Holly stared, and for the second time that day, her fingers crept unconsciously to the locket that hung around her neck. "Thank you," she said softly, looking at the doll in wonder. Then she understood. It was Phoebe's dream. The doll was not just a replacement for all the dolls the child had lost. It was an embodiment of hope. This is what I am supposed to do, Holly thought. This is what I have come for. Quickly, she caught the doll up in her arms and ran out to the shop floor. There they were, the two brothers, trying to convince Phoebe to come away. The tiny girl looked from one to the other, shaking her head. Holly walked swiftly toward the group and knelt before the little girl. "Look," she said, "I found your doll." Phoebe stared down at the small, laughing face, and her eyes grew round with astonishment. "It's me," she whispered. "It's me!" Her brothers leaned over curiously. "Great Scott, Phoebe! It is you!" exclaimed Frank. "But fatter and bigger," said Phoebe, patting the doll's round cheeks. "All better again." "Yes," Holly suggested. "Perhaps it's you as you will be soon." The two boys exchanged cautious glances, but Phoebe was enraptured. She smiled with quiet satisfaction and gripped the doll in her arms. "When I get bigger, I'm going to have a dress just like this," she said. "We'll take this doll," said George to Holly. And then, less certainly, "How much is it?" Holly smiled at him. "There's no charge for this doll. She belongs to Phoebe." Phoebe wrenched her eyes away from the doll and gave Holly a grateful smile. "Thank you, miss. Thank you for finding my doll." "You're welcome, Phoebe dear." Holly watched as the boys escorted their sister out of the store. At the window, they stopped, and Phoebe lifted the doll's hand to wave goodbye. "How'd you do that?" said a low voice at her elbow. It was Jeremy. "There ain't no dolls back there." Holly leaned toward him confidentially. "It's a secret, Jeremy. I couldn't possibly reveal it." "Also, I don't know," said Holly with a giggle. "That little thing, she didn't look so puny when she had her dolly," observed Jeremy thoughtfully. "Maybe you could make one for Lissy later. Might chirk her up some." "I'll make one for all the children at the park, Jeremy. I promise. Lissy first of all." But first the swelling crowds had to be attended to. Holly and Jeremy and Mr. Kleiner worked side by side as the afternoon wore on, until the street lamps flickered on. Almost everyone had gone home now. There were only 2 customers left, an elderly man and a young girl. Holly was straightening up a disheveled display of stereopticons when she heard a familiar voice wafting across the store. "And you call this a toy shop? With not a single doll in stock, I wonder that you don't find yourself accused of false advertisement." Grandfather, begged a young voice, I don't need another doll anyway. I'd much rather have this little library. See? It has a cunning case. See how it all fits? Louise, said the elderly man, you do not want a library, and you needn't attempt to convince me that you do. You wanted a doll, and I see no reasonable explanation for a toy shop that does not carry dolls. He waved irritably at a passing snowflake. Crikey, whispered Jeremy. It's that old bellyacre from McElhenney's. Mr. Sterling was no less angry among Carol's curiosities and wonders than he had been at the sausage pavilion in the park. His face was pursed into a knot of fury, and his cheeks were the color of a boiled lobster. His granddaughter, who still accompanied him, was also pink, but with shame. She hung her head as he continued to rant at Mr. Kleiner. Though she was sympathetic to Mr. Kleiner's torment, it was Louise's plight that pulled at Holly. She skimmed across the floor to the girl's side. The child was dressed in a warm coat of dark blue wool edged with fur, but she was as piteous as any child Holly had yet seen on earth. The girl's scrupulously arranged ringlets hid her burning face, but as Holly bent at her side, she caught sight of her stricken eyes. Holly straightened. Actually, sir, we do carry dolls in our shop, but they are so very special that we are not able to put them on the shelves. However, I can bring one out for your granddaughter if you like. Mr. Sterling stopped in mid-diatribe and attempted to rearrange his features into something other than outrage. He sniffed. Yes, bring it out at once. If you please, added Louise softly. Mr. Kleiner opened his mouth to contradict and then closed it again. It will be just a moment, he said to Mr. Sterling. 5 minutes later, just as Mr. Sterling was beginning to sneer about the unmitigated insolence of that irresponsible lackey, Holly returned. Mr. Sterling finally fell quiet, for he saw that she carried in her arms a replica of his grandchild. There was Louise, undeniably Louise, with her soft dark curls and her light brown eyes and her generous mouth. But this Louise was a dancer. She was dressed in a trailing diaphanous gown glistening with sequins, and on her feet were white satin point shoes. Her legs were long and slim, and her graceful arms were arranged in an attitude of rest. Her wide mouth was closed and serious, and the fearful expression in the child's eyes was replaced with a calm look of resolution in the doll's. What sort of hogwash is this? Cried Sterling, pointing a shaking finger at the doll, but his harangue was interrupted by his granddaughter's odd voice. How did you know? She demanded, turning to Holly, surprise overcoming fear. How did you know that I wanted to be a dancer? I've wanted to be a dancer all my life. I could tell, dear, said Holly. I could tell by the way you walk. Balderdash, exploded Mr. Sterling. Utter nonsense! You do not want to be a dancer, Louise. No granddaughter of mine will be a dancer. I don't know what you are about, young lady, he directed at Holly, but I don't think much of it. Don't speak to her that way. Louise's voice surprised them all. Mr. Sterling looked flabbergasted. I don't know how she knew, but she's right. I want to be a dancer. Every week when you think I'm at Miss Finkin's learning how to waltz, I really slip across the hall and study ballet. And I'm good, she added decidedly. I'm very good, and I will be a dancer. And, she said, holding out her hand to her grandfather, I am your granddaughter, and I always will be. If his nose had fallen off his face and walked out the front door, Mr. Sterling could be no more astounded than he was now. He seemed to be preparing for an almighty explosion. He gathered his voice, opened his mouth, and abruptly shut it again. All at once, he looked very proud. Why, Louise, I do believe you've got the Sterling spirit. He whacked her lightly on the back. Have you really been sneaking off to take ballet lessons? He asked admiringly. Yes, grandfather, said Louise, smiling a bit now. This seemed to put Mr. Sterling in the best of spirits. "Ha!" he shouted. "Chip off the old block! Never underestimate a Sterling. Ha!" Holly smiled and drew away. The doll shows the way, and they follow it, she thought. A doll made of dreams. The idea caught and flamed within her. Oh, yes, she thought, this is it. Oh, Papa, I wish I could tell you what I've learned. The dolls are their guides. They will lead the children to their dreams. Cautiously, she glanced at Mr. Kleiner. She had expected him to look appalled, but he did not. He looked quite merry. Their eyes met. He pointed up to the enchanted snow, then down to Louise's dream doll, and then, without a word, he pulled a key from his pocket and handed it to her. It was the key to the shop door. "How much for this fine doll?" Mr. Sterling was saying. Holly opened her mouth, but Mr. Kleiner cut smoothly in. $4. "Very well." Mr. Sterling brought forth the notes. As he and Louise walked from the store, she turned back to say goodbye to Holly. "Thank you. This doll makes me not so scared to be a dancer," she said. Now it was well and truly night. Mr. Kleiner closed the shop door, and they set about tidying the shop for the next day. As they worked, Holly sipped at her healthful carrot soup, and the lady cake was very nice. She and Jeremy shared it as they arranged a swarm of mechanical animals into a parade. Mr. Kleiner counted the money in the till. "Easily our most successful day ever," he announced, putting his spectacles on his head and counting once more. "Miss Claus, you and your abilities are a mystery to me, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I promise to ask you no questions. That should please you." "Thank you for your good opinion, Mr. Kleiner," said Holly demurely. She took a breath. "May I ask you a favor?" "Certainly, Miss Claus," he said, adding again. The total hardly seemed possible. "May I sleep here in the storeroom?" she asked hesitantly. "I've nowhere else to stay." Mr. Kleiner looked up. "Oh, my dear child," he said compassionately. "I would gladly give you shelter here, but Mr. Carroll would never allow such a thing. He's an extremely private man, and he lives in the apartment above stairs. Oh, no, he would never permit it. We both get the sack. But," he continued, brightening, "I believe I have a room for you at my own place of residence. You see, my wife and we have a boarding house, a most respectable lodging, and there's a vacant room at the moment. It's quite convenient to the shop, yes, indeed, just a few blocks away." "Scratch," said Jeremy loudly. "Beg your pardon?" said Mr. Kleiner. "Scratch. She ain't got any money," he explained. "Oh, that's easily remedied," said Mr. Kleiner. He pulled $4 out of his pocket. "This is entirely yours, Miss Claus, since you somehow produced that doll that yielded it. This is more than enough for a week's room and board. I don't say it's anything fancy, but it should satisfy. And should you further require an advance upon wages earned, I would be happy to comply." "This should be plenty," said Holly delightedly. She was a wage earner, just like a mortal. "Now you'll need to see Mr. Kleiner at once." "Now you'll need to see Mrs. Kleiner at once," Mr. Kleiner continued. "I would, under most circumstances, be delighted to guide you, but, unfortunately, I am prevented from doing so this evening due to," Mr. Kleiner smiled secretively, "a certain pressing errand. But Jeremy can take you, can't you, my boy? You know where it is, don't you?" Jeremy did, and as he collected his own afternoon's wages, Holly disappeared into the storeroom and returned with her green hat firmly fixed to her coppery curls and her bulging satchel over her arm. As they prepared to leave, a soft knock sounded at the door. Behind the counter, Mr. Kleiner started and looked nervously at the black shadow that loomed against the glass. "Mr. Carroll?" he called. Silence. Then a knock once more. Mr. Kleiner slipped off his stool and approached the door. "Is that you, Mr. Carroll?" he said warily, turning a key in the lock. A smooth voice replied, "Hunter Hardman is the name, and you must be Mr. Kleiner. Very pleased to make your acquaintance. Your shop was recommended to me by Mr. Lucius Burns of Pittsburgh." Mr. Hartman edged inside the door, his eyes fixed upon Mr. Kleiner with intense friendliness. "Ah," said Mr. Kleiner uncomfortably. "And how is Mr. Burns?" "Somewhat troubled by lumbago," said Hunter Hartman unconcernedly, glancing around the shop. "I see that he was correct in his description. This shop is indeed a wonderland." He smiled warmly, his soft eyes slipping around the little circle of observers, pausing ever so briefly on Tundra before moving on. "And precisely what I have been seeking. I am in need of a great number of toys for a certain project of my own." Again his glance seemed to include them all, and his smile grew warmer still. "I was told by Mr. Burns that Mr. Carroll's shop would see me through the task, and," he opened his arms wide, "it is so." From the dark street outside, a sharp rhythm of footsteps could be heard. There was a pause, and Mr. Carroll stepped into the store. He, too, glanced around the little circle, but there was no warmth in his look. Unconsciously, Holly stepped back, until her back met the cool glass case behind her. She watched, hypnotized, as his eyes raked across Hartman's friendly face. "What have we here?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "This is Mr. Hartman," began Mr. Kleiner, but he was interrupted by Hartman himself. "Mr. Hunter Hartman, at your service," said the visitor, extending his hand. After a slight hesitation, Mr. Carroll responded with his own. "I'm in need of toys, sir. A mutual acquaintance of mine and Mr. Kleiner's, knowing of a certain project I have undertaken, suggested that I may make my purchases here at your shop." "What leads you to believe that this shop is mine?" responded Mr. Carroll coolly. Hartman's gray eyes flashed with anger, but it was soon subsumed in a jovial smile. "You are Mr. Carroll, are you not?" Mr. Carroll nodded briefly. "Aha! You see, I guessed correctly. And now, perhaps, might I embark upon my shopping? Time is of the essence. Perhaps this young lady," the friendly eyes lingered on Holly, slipping from her wide green eyes down to her lips, "would be so kind as to assist me." Tundra pressed himself hard against Holly's knees, and she heard a distant rumble in his throat. "I'd be glad," she began slowly. "My store is closed for the evening," Mr. Carroll said curtly, not looking in her direction. "My dear sir," said Mr. Hartman, "I assure you that you will be amply recompensed for your time. "My store is closed," Carroll repeated. "We open tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I really must insist that you take your leave. Good night." He stood, arrow straight, blocking the way into the shop. There was a short silence. Mr. Hartman nodded stiffly and left. "Good night, Mr. Carroll," said Jeremy, oblivious to the tension. Caught between regret for lost business and relief at his release from Mr. Hartman, Mr. Kleiner wished his employer a good evening and headed with a sigh into the frosty air. Holly could not help stealing a final look at Mr. Carroll. He was staring fixedly at Tundra, who was gazing back at him. "That's my dog, Tundra," she blurted, for want of something to say. Mr. Carroll looked up, and she saw that his eyes, empty now of anger, were tired. But her words brought a flash of amusement to his face. "Do you take me for a fool, Miss Claus?" "Excuse me, sir?" she stammered. "That's a wolf. Good night, Miss Claus." With a slight bow, he turned on his heel and walked toward the shadowy staircase. Outside, Mr. Hartman waited. When Holly stepped out the door, she found him deep in conversation with Mr. Kleiner. He turned at her approach and smiled broadly. "And will you introduce me to your lovely assistant?" he said. Mr. Kleiner nodded. "Miss Claus, Mr. Hartman. Mr. Hartman will return tomorrow to complete his purchases." Taking Holly's hand, Mr. Hartman bowed deeply. "I am delighted to make your acquaintance, Miss Claus. Mr. Kleiner tells me that you have an intimate knowledge of the world of toys. I will place myself entirely in your hands. Though they are," he said, gazing down at her hand, which he still held in his gloved hand, "rather too lovely for such a burden." His words hung in the air, and he smiled charmingly around the circle. Mr. Kleiner cleared his throat. "Do excuse me, I really must take my leave. Pressing engagement," he scurried away down the dark street. "Perhaps you will let me see you home," said Mr. Hartman. "It is dark for a young lady to travel alone." Tundra sat down firmly on her feet, but Holly had already begun to refuse. "Oh, no thank you, Mr. Hartman. Jeremy will be seeing me home tonight," she grinned at the boy, "because without him, I don't know where home is." "Yeah, come on, Holly," said Jeremy suddenly. "We better get along. I bet it's after 7 already." Mr. Hartman pulled a glistening pocket watch from his waistcoat. "1/4 past, young man." "All right, Jeremy. Good night, Mr. Hartman," said Holly. "Miss Claus." Hartman reached out a hand to detain her. She waited. "Miss Claus, may I be so bold as to say that finding you here is like stumbling upon a delicate flower in the midst of a parched desert. Royal courts, balls, society parties, and receptions I have been to, but never have I seen a lady who exceeds you in beauty. Forgive me for my audacity." He bowed his head humbly. Holly smiled. "You are forgiven, and now good night." She, Tundra, and Jeremy stepped away and were soon lost in the darkness. Hartman watched them go. Till tomorrow. Chapter 19.